Hey everyone, Mark from Flight Sim School. Today I'm going to be covering a topic that's often asked about by beginners and can still pose some trouble for people who have a lot of experience with Flight Sim. For people who are already familiar with the trim control, you might still want to stick around because I will have a few tips and tricks spread throughout the video on how to make the trim feel a little bit more natural in the game. Even after more than 20 years of building flight simulators, the trim is something that still doesn't quite feel right in the game, and I'll explain why in a couple seconds. I'm also going to explain why the trim exists, show you how it physically works in the plane, when you should use it, and how to adjust the trim in flight. Before I get going, I just want to remind you, if you get any value out of this video, or if you enjoyed any previous video that I've done, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. As usual, if you have any questions or comments, make sure to put them below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Alright, let's start by understanding what the trim is actually doing for us. I'm in a climb at the moment, but if I wanted to level off at say 3,000 feet, which is coming up in a couple of seconds, what I would first start by doing is I would apply forward pressure on the stick. So by applying that forward pressure, all it's going to do is I'm going to level off and cancel out any altitude gain. Now, I'm holding forward pressure on my stick at the moment to maintain that 3,000 feet. If I release that forward pressure on the stick, just like right there, you can see the plane is going to pitch up again. That's not ideal because it means I can't let go of the controls at any time, and it's going to be pretty inconvenient to do any type of maneuvers. That's where the trim comes in. It's going to allow me to release that forward pressure on the stick, and it's going to allow me to maintain a steady airspeed. What the trim is doing is it's actually adjusting the pitch, which is the angle that the nose makes with the horizon. It does that with a control that's at the back of the airplane, and by adjusting that control, you'll be able to maintain the plane in whatever pitch attitude that you want. So before I show you how I actually adjust the trim, let's head back onto the ground so I can give you a little bit more information about how the trim works, how to adjust it in the game. Alright, I am going to zoom in on the trim control surface, which is right at the back of the airplane. Some airplanes have a trim on only one side of the aileron, some have it on both. I guess it really just depends on the size of the aircraft. So when I actually adjust the trim control, you can see it moving in the game, which is kind of neat. There's a few different ways you can monitor the trim's position. The most useful way that I find to keep an eye on the trim is the trim control right here. You can very quickly at a glance see where it's set relative to the neutral takeoff position in the middle, and it really gives you a better idea of what's actually going on with the trim. Whereas if I compare to what's in the cockpit, if I hide the yoke, you can see the elevator trim wheel is right here. But it's a lot harder to read this little control when you're flying. You'd have to look down, and it's never a good idea to look away from the outside when you're flying. So for that reason, sometimes I'll really just quickly switch to the external view to see where the trim position is, and then come back to the internal view to continue flying the plane. There are also a few different ways that you can go about adjusting the trim position. The first one, as you probably guessed, is the wheel that's right here. You can grab it with your mouse and move it up or down, but that's again not really useful because you can't be looking out of the cockpit and making trim adjustments. For that reason, there are also keyboard shortcuts that are assigned to nose up and nose down trim. What I recommend is to actually put it to 2 keys on the joystick column. There are a few planes that have a trim that's operated exactly like this in real life. I believe the Diamond is like that, and there are a few other planes in the game that also have the trim adjustment on the joystick. I'm using the Logitech Extreme 3D Pro for the moment because I'm having a problem with my usual joystick, and what I've done is I've assigned it to keys number 3 and 5, which is right at the top of the joystick, very similar to what you would see on the real airplane. The other option is to use the hat switch, which is also something that I've seen some people do. But if you start playing with the hat switch, you need to reassign the way that you switch between the cockpit views, and I found that to just become more and more confusing as you start playing with more and more control assignments. So for that reason, I really stick to two other keys and I leave the hat switch as is for controlling the views. But again, it's a personal preference. If you might find that a little bit more intuitive. The other way you can control the trim is you can actually assign it to your mouse wheel. I have done that here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. And you can see now when I scroll my mouse wheel, it's actually moving the trim. It works pretty well, actually, I find, if you do it, but the problem is, again, the mouse wheel is assigned to other keys, notably the zoom in and zoom out keys. So if you start doing that, you end up with double assignments on the mouse wheel, and at times it doesn't work, or it'll get confused as to whether it's being supposed to be doing zoom or nose trim. So for that reason, I really just stick with the joystick keys. In some airplanes in the game, like the Airbus A320, you don't have to adjust the trim at all. The A320 is completely fly-by-wire, and if you have a look in the cockpit, you'll notice that the trim is always being adjusted automatically for you. There's been some talk on the flight simulator forums about doing something similar for the propeller-based airplanes and really all the airplanes in the game because the trim is a little bit hard to adjust. Finally, the other thing to be aware of that I've seen on the flight sim forums is that the trim is actually applied in a nonlinear fashion. That means when you hold the trim button down, it's actually going to accelerate faster. I haven't really seen that behavior, and you can see I'm bringing the trim back down to center, and it doesn't seem to really be accelerating. But it's just something to keep an eye on in case you experience that yourself. The workaround, obviously, to not have it run away from you is really just to apply the trim in short bursts. That way, the nonlinear acceleration just won't happen. All right, I'm going to set my trim for takeoff now. One thing I've noticed with the latest updates to the game is that it's best to apply the trim at the bottom of the green area in the trim dial. They made some changes to the ground effects in the latest update, and if you leave the trim in the middle of the green section, it's going to require a lot more back pressure on the stick to be able to pull off the runway. Putting it at the bottom of the green range seems to be the sweet spot now. Alright, so I am in a climb right now up to 3,500 feet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let the plane continue to climb for now. And as I get closer to 3,300 feet, I'm going to apply forward pressure on the stick to cancel out that altitude gain. I'll do that obviously by keeping an eye on the altimeter, but I can also do it by just keeping an eye on the vertical speed indicator just below the altimeter. Alright, so I'm coming up on 3,500 now, so I'm going to slow my climb, and once I get to 3,500, I'll cancel it out completely. The other thing that I'm doing is I'm lowering my power settings to my cruise speed, which in this plane is around 2300 RPM, just about there. So now what I've got to do is I actually have to wait for the airspeed of the plane to settle down. I can start applying a little bit of trim, but I won't be able to make a very accurate adjustment yet because I'm still accelerating. The amount of trim you're going to need is going to be based on your airspeed that you're flying. So in that sense, you can make some rough adjustments to the trim before your airspeed is settled down, but really you're going to have to wait until you've reached your cruise airspeed before making any final adjustments. So now that my airspeed has settled down, what I'm going to do is very simple. All I do is I really just apply a little bit of nose down trim, and I release a little bit of the pressure on the stick, and I see what happens with the airplane. If it's still climbing, I'll apply a little bit more pressure on the stick again, and then release the pressure again, give it a couple seconds to settle down, and again, if I see it go up again, I'll apply just a wee bit more pressure one more time on the trim, and then it should be pretty much settled down now. As you can see, like I was saying, the VSI isn't perfect. It does bounce up and down a little bit. Don't chase that 0 vertical airspeed. You really just need it to be approximate and stay within 100 feet of your cruise altitude. You'll also notice there's a lot of bouncing around as you're adjusting the trim. Unfortunately, there's no real way around that in the game. In real life, you would feel the pressure on the yoke or the joystick, and it makes adjusting the trim a whole lot easier because as you're adjusting the trim, that pressure is going to get released and you can easily tell where the sweet spot is going to be. But unfortunately, we're in the game, so you're going to have to live with a little bit of bouncing around, and honestly, I think it's alright. Also, don't forget that if you're making an airspeed change or a power change, you're going to have to retrim the plane again. Every single change is going to result in even the smallest amount of trim change that you're going to have to apply. So just like I did before, you wait for your airspeed to settle down, and once your airspeed is settled down, you can adjust your trim to cancel out the altitude gain or loss, whatever the change has brought on. Finally, it's time to look at when you should actually apply the trim. So the answer is actually pretty easy, and it's most of the time. Obviously, you're going to want to use trim when you're in a cruise. You're not going to want to have to hold any type of pressure on the stick. You really just want to be able to let the plane fly itself until you get to your destination. For short climbs in a sense, I tend to make a rough trim adjustment. Because it's difficult to get the trim right perfectly very quickly in the game, I don't try and get it perfect. I just try and get it so that I don't have to have as much of a workout with my arm. For a longer climb or ascent, I'll generally make a much more accurate trim adjustment. Let's say I wanted to climb up to my cruise altitude and I wanted to maintain 500 feet per minute. Well, I'll trim to get to that 500 feet per minute at whatever the airspeed that's going to be. The same thing is true for approach and landings. I'll do an approximate adjustment of the trim. I won't try and get it perfect again because I just don't have enough time. And finally, when you're on final approach, I do as well make a change to the trim there. Again, I try and get it approximately right so I don't have to have too much forward or back pressure on the stick, and I just deal with the rest myself. Things tend to happen so fast on final anyways that I don't feel like it's that huge of a deal. In general, you should be alright to just hold a little bit of forward or back pressure as you're doing your final approach and landing. This is obviously a bit different than in real life. In real life, you would definitely want to make a proper trim adjustment on final, but unfortunately, we're limited by what we can do in the game. Alright, so that's all I wanted to cover for how to adjust the trim. If you have any questions, comments, follow-ups, please put them in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. It really makes a big difference. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.